from the Socialist Party. You might also know me from Stoke Rock scene if you're an addict like me, and I'm Big D. I told Craig from Halish that I'd do a 15-minute sort of introduction on what capitalism is. So, you know, here it goes. So capitalism, you know, what is it? Well, there's plenty of definitions of what capitalism is. And I don't really want to waste time on defining what capitalism is. I'd rather talk a little about the effects of capitalism. I'm sure many people in this room, even if they're not conscious anti-capitalists, would find themselves agreeing with a lot of what I'm about to say. Now, capitalism divides humanity into different classes, and I'm sure you've all heard about, you know, the ruling class and the middle class and the working class. Now, because of the nature of capitalism, wealth tends to get concentrated into the hands of the ruling class. And by ruling class, I don't mean politicians. Well, I do mean politicians, but also you've got employers counted in the ruling class. I'll just talk a bit about the scale of this concentration of wealth. It was on the BBC News website on Tuesday that a new report had been published highlighting the wealth divide that exists in the world today. This report said that the richest 2% of the world's population, i.e. all the world's millionaires and billionaires, own more wealth than the poorest 50% of the world's population. Now let that sink in for a second. The richest 200 out of that 2% of the world's population now own more than 1,000 billion US dollars. 1,000 billion. That's 1,000 with 9 zeros after it. And I don't know about you, I can't literally comprehend that amount of money. In the human brain, I don't think can possibly cope with numbers that big. And while at the same time, we have over 2 billion people who live on less than 50 pence a day. And it's the capitalist system that condemns these 2 billion people to live life in poverty, while a tiny, tiny minority have such an obscene amount of wealth that it's actually unimaginable. It's the capitalist system based on a need for profit, on the need to maximise profit margins for these few disgustingly rich managing directors and shareholders. And in the name of the market and in the name of competition, drives down wages and living conditions for the majority of the world's population. And it's the capitalist system that has meant that chief executives' pay, not including bonuses, has gone up from 30 times the wage of an average worker in the year 2000 to 100 times the wage of an average worker in just 6 years. And it's a capitalist system that means the majority of the world's resources are owned and controlled by 500 multinationals. And it's the capitalist system that means that the total household debt in Britain today has gone up to over £1 trillion. So what does this particularly mean for us in the UK? In the 1980s, capitalism entered the era that's commonly known now as neoliberalism, which was the liberalisation of the markets and focused less on state intervention in the market, and obviously, you know, more on privatisation of the state-owned industries. So what do these free market policies mean for us? The supposedly Labour government has presided over an increasing amount of privatisation in the NHS, all in the name of progress and reform. The government is trying to run the NHS like a business. That's why locally we've seen 1,200 redundancies in the North Staffs Hospital because of all things it went over budget by £20 million. Now, a hospital going over budget by £20 million, that doesn't seem to quite make sense to me. I prefer to think of it as that the hospital itself was underfunded £20 million. And how can you put a price on someone's health? And at the same time, we're building new hospitals all over the country. These hospitals with a difference. They're called Private Finance Initiative Hospitals, or PFI. These hospitals are being built all over the country So I'll tell you a little bit about these PFI hospitals. Basically, the government finds a private company and gets them to build a hospital for us, which we then rent back from the private company on a 30-year contract for around £40 million a year, which, as you can imagine, works out a lot more expensive than building a hospital of our own in the first place. And in fact, a lot of these hospitals will never be publicly owned in the end. I'm moving on sort of related to the NHS. There's something very rotten about when a drug company can charge £20,000 per patient for a life-saving drug like a septum. But that's really just the tip of the iceberg with the pharmaceutical companies. There's a massive case for the nationalisation of the pharmaceutical industries to stop the fat cats creaming off the profits from these stupidly expensive drugs that these companies have produced. And let's be clear about this. Drug companies exist for one reason and one reason only. And that's the same as any other company exists for, and that's to make money. And they have no interest in making unprofitable drugs to cure unprofitable diseases. Now just think for a moment what a nationalised drug company could achieve, how much money it could save the taxpayer every year, and cheap drugs could be mass-produced without the need to add huge premiums on top of them. So what else does Blair's Britain mean for us? I'm sure that some students and graduates in the room tonight, I'm sure that some of those students have taken out student loans to cover their tuition. The government has told us that there isn't enough money to fund university education. So we have to take out student loans from a private company to cover the costs. And we're being told this by hypocritical politicians who got into the position that they're in now because of their free education, their student grants. But when it comes to war and occupation, there's a blank checkbook. Britain's total spending on the Iraq war has now reached well over the £5 billion mark. And that's more than the government has spent on education, housing and the NHS combined in the same period. The Iraq war has been well documented, and for most people, it's become clear, to put it bluntly, they were up to our necks in shit in Iraq. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by telling you how illegal the war is, or how non-existent the weapons of mass destruction are, and the non-existent link to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And I'm not going to talk about how we wouldn't even be there if there was no oil fields to privatise. I'm not going to talk about how Bush and Blair should be sharing the dock with Saddam Hussein for the war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I'll move on. In the past 5 or 6 years, we've seen a marked increase in the votes for the British National Party. And again, I'm not going to talk about how racist they are, because I think that much is obvious. And it was obvious to the 4,000 people who voted the BNP in local elections in this city this year.